The courtroom was quiet, but the tension in the air was almost unbearable. Every person seated in the rows of wooden benches seemed to hold their breath as they waited for what would happen next. At the center of it all stood a man who looked like he had seen too much of life. His face was lined with deep wrinkles, and his once strong frame now appeared slightly bent, as though carrying an invisible weight. He wore a simple suit, its fabric worn at the edges, but there was something about him that commanded respect, a quiet dignity that couldn't be ignored. This was no ordinary defendant. This was a veteran, someone who had once worn a uniform and served his country. The judge's voice cut through the silence, sharp and authoritative. "Mr. Daniel Carter," he began, glancing down at the papers spread across his desk. "You are hereby ordered to pay a fine of $50,000 within 30 days. The amount hung heavily in the room, echoing off the walls. For most people, such a sum would feel insurmountable, but for Daniel, it might as well have been $1 million. His eyes flickered briefly toward the floor before returning to meet the judge's stern gaze. There was no anger in his expression, only exhaustion. It wasn't the first time he'd faced adversity, but this moment felt particularly cruel. Daniel had spent years trying to piece together a life after leaving the military, but nothing had gone according to plan. When he first returned home, he thought things would fall into place easily. After all, he had given so much, his youth, his health, even parts of his soul, to protect others. But civilian life proved far more complicated than he ever imagined. Jobs were scarce, and those he managed to find barely paid enough to cover rent, let alone the growing pile of medical bills from injuries sustained during his service. Over time, debt crept up on him like a shadow, relentless and suffocating. What started as small loans turned into larger ones, and soon creditors were knocking on his door, demanding repayment. Today's court case stemmed from one such creditor, A.T., bank that had grown tired of waiting for Daniel to settle his overdue payments. Their lawyers argued passionately, painting him as negligent and irresponsible. They presented documents showing missed deadlines and accumulating interest, making it seem as though Daniel had willfully ignored his obligations. To them, he was just another name on a list, another file to close. No one bothered to ask why he hadn't paid or what struggles he faced behind closed doors. All they cared about was the bottom line. As the judge delivered his verdict, Daniel remained still, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. Inside, however, a storm raged. How could he possibly come up with such a large sum? Selling his modest apartment wouldn't even come close, and asking friends for help was out of the question. They had their own problems to deal with. Yet, despite the despair clawing at him, Daniel refused to let himself break down. Not here, not now. He had learned long ago how to mask pain, how to keep moving forward even when every step felt like walking through quicksand. The courtroom buzzed softly as spectators whispered among themselves. Some looked sympathetic, while others simply stared, blankly, detached from the human drama unfolding before them. Reporters scribbled notes furiously, eager to capture the details of yet another legal battle involving a struggling veteran. Few truly understood the gravity of the situation, though. To them, Daniel was just another headline, a statistic wrapped in faded glory. But Daniel knew better. He knew the truth of his sacrifices, the nights spent lying awake replaying memories he wished he could forget. And now, standing in this cold, impersonal space, he realized he had two choices: accept defeat or fight back. Choosing to speak, Daniel raised his hand slightly, signaling the judge. The movement was subtle, almost hesitant, but it caught everyone's attention. The murmurs ceased instantly, replaced by an eerie silence. All eyes turned to him, curious and expectant. Even the judge leaned back in his chair, intrigued by the unexpected gesture. Taking a deep breath, Daniel stepped forward, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "Your Honor," he began, his words measured and clear. "Before we conclude, may I say something?" The judge nodded, granting permission with a wave of his hand. Daniel swallowed hard, gathering his thoughts. He knew this was his chance, not just to explain his financial troubles, but to reveal something far greater, something that had been buried for years. hidden beneath layers of trauma and secrecy. As he opened his mouth to speak, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Gone was the indifference, replaced by an unspoken anticipation. Whatever Daniel was about to share, it was clear it wouldn't be ordinary. Little did anyone know. His words were about to change everything for him and for everyone listening. Daniel stood there, his hands clasped tightly in front of him as if trying to hold himself together. The courtroom was so quiet that the faint hum of the air conditioner seemed unnaturally loud. All eyes were on him, waiting for what he would say next. He took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling slowly before speaking again. His voice was calm but carried a weight that made people lean forward slightly, eager to hear more. "Your Honor," Daniel began, his tone respectful yet firm, "I understand the seriousness of this case and the court's decision. I don't deny that. I owe money, and I take full responsibility for my debts. But I ask you to consider the circumstances behind them." He paused, glancing briefly at the judge before continuing. "When I left the military, I thought I could start over, rebuild my life. But it hasn't been easy. There are things I've faced, things I carry with me every day, that have made it hard to move forward." The judge's expression softened, slightly, though he remained attentive. Others in the room exchanged curious glances, sensing that Daniel was about to reveal something significant. Even the bank's lawyers, who had earlier been confident in their victory, now looked uneasy. They hadn't expected this turn. Daniel shifted his stance, his shoulders squaring as though bracing himself. "Before I explain further, I want to share a part of my past, a part that not many people know about. It's not something I talk about, often because it's painful, but today I feel it's necessary." He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Unfolding it carefully, he held it up for everyone to see. It was an old photograph, its edges frayed and colors faded with time. In the picture, a younger Daniel stood alongside a group of soldiers, their faces smeared with dirt, but smiling, despite the chaos around them. "This was taken during one of my deployments overseas," Daniel said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "We weren't just soldiers, we were protectors. Our mission wasn't always clear-cut or straightforward. Sometimes we were sent into areas where civilians were trapped in the crossfire, places no one else wanted to go." He paused, his gaze drifting to the photo as if reliving those moments. "One particular mission changed everything for me, and for my team." He lowered the photograph but didn't put it away. Instead, he held it close as though drawing strength from it. It happened in a small village surrounded by mountains. Intelligence reports suggested that enemy forces were using the area as a base, but what they didn't tell us was that dozens of innocent families were being held captive there. When we arrived, we found men, women, and children locked inside makeshift cages, starving and terrified. Some of them were injured, others barely clinging to life. The courtroom was completely silent now, the kind of silence where even the smallest sound would echo loudly. Daniel's words painted a vivid picture, and the audience couldn't help but imagine the scene he described. A few people shifted, uncomfortably in their seats, while others stared intently, hanging on every word. "We knew we had to act quickly," Daniel continued, his voice steady, but laced with emotion. "But it wasn't going to be easy. The enemy was heavily armed and reinforcements were hours away. We didn't have the luxury of waiting. So, we devised a plan to distract the guards while sneaking into the compound and freeing the hostages. It was risky, almost suicidal, but we didn't have a choice. Those people were counting on us." As he spoke, Daniel's posture straightened and his voice grew stronger, as though he was drawing courage from the memory of his comrades. "My team and I split up, each of us taking on different roles. I led the group responsible for breaking into the holding area. We moved silently, avoiding detection as best we could. But when we reached the cages, we realized the situation was worse than we'd anticipated. The hostages were weak, some too frightened to move. We had to work fast to get them out safely." He paused, closing his eyes for a brief moment. When he opened them again, there was a flicker of pain in his expression, but also a glimmer of pride. "We managed to free most of the hostages, but not without cost. As we were leading them to safety, the enemy discovered our presence. Shots rang out and chaos erupted. My team fought valiantly, holding off the attackers long enough for the civilians to escape. But not all of us made it out alive. The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Daniel's voice cracked slightly as he added, 3 of my closest friends died that day. Men I trusted with my life. Men who gave everything to save strangers they didn't even know. Their sacrifice allowed those families to live. But it came at a price I'll never forget. For a moment, no one spoke. The judge sat motionless, his pen resting against the desk. The reporters who had been scribbling notes furiously stopped, their pens hovering mid-air. Even the bank's lawyers seemed affected, their earlier confidence replaced by an awkward uncertainty. Daniel's story wasn't just about debt or missed payments. It was about survival, loss, and the scars that never fully heal. I came home after that mission, Daniel said finally, his voice softer now. But I wasn't the same. The memories followed me everywhere, in my dreams, in my thoughts, in the way I interacted with the world. I tried to adjust, to find a new purpose, but it wasn't easy. The injuries I sustained during that operation left me unable to work certain jobs, and the nightmares kept me from sleeping. I sought help, but resources for veterans like me were limited. Eventually, I turned to loans to make ends meet, hoping things would improve. But they didn't. He looked directly at the judge, his eyes filled with both vulnerability and resolve. I'm not here to excuse my debts or ask for special treatment. I'm simply asking for understanding, for the court to see the bigger picture. What you're seeing today is the result of years of struggle, not negligence. I've carried the burden of my past for a long time, and I'll continue to do so. But I need a chance to rebuild, to prove that I can overcome this. The courtroom remained silent, the tension palpable. For the first time, the people watching weren't just seeing a man in financial trouble. They were seeing a hero, someone who had sacrificed everything only to face new battles upon returning home. And as Daniel stood there, his story laid bare for all to hear, it became clear that this case wasn't just about money anymore. It was about justice, humanity, and whether the system could recognize the value of a life lived in service to others. The silence in the courtroom stretched on, heavy and unbroken. Daniel's words seemed to linger in the air, each one carrying the weight of untold sacrifices. The judge sat motionless, his expression unreadable, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of emotion. It was as if he were trying to process not just the legal arguments before him, but the human story that had unfolded. For the first time since the trial began, the room felt less like a formal court and more like a space where lives intersected, where decisions carried consequences far beyond paperwork and penalties. Daniel took another step forward, his movements deliberate yet humble. He reached into his pocket again, this time pulling out a small stack of papers tied together with a frayed rubber band. They looked worn, as though they had been handled countless times over the years. Carefully, he placed them on the table near the judge, pushing them gently forward. These are letters, he explained, his voice low but steady. Some are from the families we saved during that mission. Others are from fellow soldiers who served with me. I've kept them all these years because they remind me of why I did what I did and why I keep going, even when it feels impossible. He paused, glancing down at the letters for a moment before looking back up at the judge. I'd like to share one of them if I may. Without waiting for permission, he untied the rubber band and sifted through the pages until he found the one he was looking for. Holding it up, he cleared his throat softly and began to read aloud. Dear Mr. Carter, he started, his voice trembling slightly as he spoke the words written by someone else so many years ago. My name is Amina, and I am the mother of 2 children. You helped rescue during that terrible night. I don't know how to thank you enough for what you did. You gave us our lives back. You gave my children a future. Before that day, I thought we would never see freedom again. But because of your bravery, we have hope. Please know that wherever you are, there is a family praying for you every day. Thank you for being our hero. Daniel stopped reading, folding the letter carefully and placing it back with the others. His hands trembled faint forwards, visibly moved by the memory of those words. The courtroom remained silent, but the atmosphere had shifted. People exchanged glances, some nodding subtly, others pressing their lips together as if holding back tears. Even the bank's lawyers who had entered the room determined to win their case now looked uneasy, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. "I didn't save those people for recognition or reward," Daniel continued, his voice regaining its strength. "I did it because it was the right thing to do, and I'm not alone in that. There are thousands of veterans like me who put everything on the line, not for glory, but because they believe in something greater than themselves. Yet when we come home, we're often forgotten. We face challenges no one prepared us for, physical injuries, mental scars, financial struggles, and sometimes it feels like the world doesn't care." He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "Your Honor, I understand that laws must be followed and debts must be paid, but I ask you to consider this. How can someone rebuild their life when the system keeps pushing them further into the ground? I've tried to fix things on my own. I've worked odd jobs, sold belongings, done whatever I could to stay afloat. But every time I take one step forward, something pushes me 2 steps back. What I need isn't punishment. It's a chance to prove that I can rise above this, just like I've risen above everything else life has thrown at me." As he spoke, Daniel's voice grew firmer, filled with a quiet determination that resonated throughout the room. He wasn't pleading for pity, he was asking for fairness. "I'm not asking for charity or special treatment. I'm asking for understanding, for the court to see me as more than a number on a balance sheet. I've given so much to this country, and while I don't regret any of it, I do wish someone would extend the same kindness to me that I once extended to others." The judge leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly against the desk as he considered Daniel's words. For a moment it seemed as though he might interrupt, but instead he let the veteran continue. Daniel pressed on, his tone unwavering. "There's one more thing I want to share," he said, reaching into his pocket once more. This time he pulled out a faded military ID card, its edges worn smooth from years of use. He held it up for everyone to see, turning it slowly so the light caught the photograph of a younger, healthier version of himself. "This was me before I came home," he said, his voice tinged with both pride and sadness. "Back then I believed in absolutes, in right and wrong, in justice and fairness. I believed that if you worked hard and did the right thing, life would reward you. But reality taught me differently. Life doesn't always play fair, and sometimes even the strongest among us need help to stand back up." He lowered the ID card, clutching it tightly in his hand as if afraid to let it go. "When I left the military, I thought I could leave the war behind too. But the truth is, you never really leave it. It stays with you. In the way you flinch at loud noises, in the way you wake up drenched in sweat from nightmares you can't escape, in the way you struggle to connect with people who haven't seen what you've seen. Some days it feels like the war won't ever release its grip on you." Daniel's words struck a chord with everyone in the room. Even those who had entered the courtroom indifferent to his plight now found themselves deeply affected. His story wasn't just about debt or missed payments, it was about resilience, sacrifice, and the invisible battles fought long after the physical ones ended. It was about a man who had given everything only to find himself fighting for scraps of dignity and hope. "I'm here today not because I want sympathy," Daniel concluded, his voice softening but still strong. "I'm here because I refuse to give up. No matter how hard things get, I'll keep moving forward. All I ask is for a little compassion, a chance to show that I'm more than the mistakes I've made. Because beneath all the pain and hardship, I'm still the same person who risked everything to save strangers in a distant land, and maybe, just maybe, that counts for something." With those final words, Daniel stepped back, his shoulders squared and his head held high. The courtroom remained silent, the tension palpable as everyone waited for the judge's response. For the first time, the outcome of the case felt uncertain. What had started as a routine legal proceeding had transformed into something far deeper, the reckoning of values, humanity, and the true meaning of justice. The silence in the courtroom grew heavier, as if the air itself had thickened with emotion. Every person seated in the rows of benches seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for what would happen next. The judge sat motionless, his eyes fixed on Daniel, who now stood quietly at the center of the room. His hands were clasped behind his back, his posture straight and composed, but there was a faint tremor in his fingers that betrayed the storm raging inside him. He had laid bare his soul, sharing pieces of his life he rarely spoke about, and now he could only wait. For a long moment, the judge said nothing. His expression remained unreadable, though his eyes darted occasionally to the stack of letters and documents Daniel had placed on the table. Finally, he leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the desk. "Mr. Carter," he began, his voice calm but firm, "you've presented a compelling case, not just legally, but personally. It's clear that your service has left an indelible mark on you, one that extends far beyond the battlefield." Daniel nodded slowly, his gaze steady despite the uncertainty swirling within him. He didn't dare interrupt or respond. Instead, he focused on keeping his breathing even, each inhale and exhale deliberate and controlled. The judge continued, his tone softer now, almost reflective. "Many people come before this court seeking leniency, but few do so with the level of honesty and integrity you've shown today. You haven't asked for pity or special treatment. Instead, you've asked for understanding, and perhaps more, importantly, for a chance to rebuild." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, subtle but unmistakable. Spectators exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement while others simply stared ahead, processing what they had heard. Even the bank's lawyers, who had entered the room determined to secure a victory, now appeared conflicted. Their earlier confidence had waned, replaced by a quiet unease. They shuffled papers aimlessly, avoiding eye contact with anyone around them. The judge paused, taking a sip of water before speaking again. "It's easy to reduce cases like yours to numbers. Debts owed, payments missed, penalties accrued. But justice isn't meant to be cold or impersonal. It's meant to reflect humanity, to weigh not just actions but intentions, circumstances, and character." He glanced down at the file in front of him, flipping through its pages thoughtfully. "From what I've seen here today, Mr. Carter, your character speaks volumes. You've carried burdens most of us can scarcely imagine, yet you continue to stand tall. That takes courage, a quality we should all strive to recognize and honor." As the judge spoke, Daniel felt something shift inside him. It wasn't relief, not yet, but rather a flicker of hope, fragile and tentative, igniting in the depths of his chest. For years he had felt invisible, as though the world had turned its back on him. Now, standing in this courtroom, he realized that someone, not just anyone, but the very person tasked with deciding his fate, was truly seeing him. Not as a debtor or statistic, but as a human being. However, the judge added, raising a hand to signal caution, "This doesn't mean we can ignore the law entirely. Debts must still be addressed, responsibilities upheld. What I propose is a solution that balances accountability with compassion." He turned his attention to the representatives from the bank, his voice sharpening slightly. "Given the circumstances, I believe it's only fair to reconsider the terms of repayment. Perhaps a payment plan tailored to Mr. Carter's current financial situation would be more appropriate than a lump sum fine?" One of the bank's lawyers cleared his throat nervously, rising to his feet. "Your Honor," he began, his tone hesitant, "we appreciate the gravity of the situation and are willing to explore alternative arrangements." He glanced at Daniel briefly before looking back at the judge. "We'll work with Mr. Carter to establish a feasible plan moving forward." The judge nodded approvingly. "Good. I expect both parties to act in good faith and ensure that this matter is resolved fairly." Turning his attention back to Daniel, he added, "Mr. Carter, consider this an opportunity, a second chance to regain control of your life. Use it wisely." Daniel exhaled deeply, the tension in his shoulders easing ever so slightly. He hadn't expected such an outcome, and while the road ahead wouldn't be easy, he felt a weight lifting off him. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that things might actually get better. As the judge prepared to adjourn the session, Daniel stepped forward once more, his voice steady, but filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said, his words sincere. "I won't let this opportunity go to waste. I promise to work hard and honor the trust you're placing in me." The judge gave a small nod, a hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. When the gavel finally came down, signaling the end of the hearing, a wave of murmurs swept through the courtroom. People rose from their seats, some approaching Daniel to offer words of encouragement or pats on the back. Reporters jotted down notes furiously, eager to capture the details of the unexpected turn of events. Even the bailiff, who had remained stoic throughout the proceedings, offered Daniel a respectful nod as he passed by. Outside the courthouse, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the steps. Daniel stood there for a moment, blinking against the brightness after hours spent in the dimly lit courtroom. He felt drained, but also strangely lighter, as though a piece of the heavy burden he'd been carrying had finally been lifted. Pulling out the faded photograph of his unit, he stared at it for a long moment, tracing the faces of his fallen comrades with his thumb. "You guys always had my back," he whispered softly, his voice barely audible over the distant hum of traffic. "Looks like someone else does too." Folding the photo carefully, he slipped it back into his pocket and took a deep breath. Ahead of him stretched a path fraught with challenges, but for the first time in a long while he felt ready to face them head-on. As he descended the courthouse steps, a group of strangers approached him, ordinary citizens who had attended the trial and been moved by his story. One of them handed him a business card, offering assistance with job placement and counseling services for veterans. Another pressed a small envelope into his hand, explaining that it contained a donation to help him get back on his feet. Tears welled up in Daniel's eyes, but he blinked them away quickly, managing a grateful smile. Walking away from the courthouse, Daniel realized something important. He wasn't alone anymore. While the scars of his past would always remain, he now had allies, people who saw his struggles and wanted to help. And though the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, he knew he had the strength to keep moving forward. After all, resilience wasn't about never falling. It was about finding the courage to rise again, no matter how many times life knocked you down. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the streets as Daniel walked away from the courthouse. Each step felt lighter than the last, though he knew the weight of his responsibilities hadn't disappeared. It had simply shifted. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of possibility, as if the walls that had trapped him were beginning to crumble. The kindness of strangers lingered with him, their words of encouragement echoing softly in his mind. Yet beneath the surface, there was still a quiet ache, a reminder of everything he'd endured and lost along the way. As he turned onto a quieter street, Daniel's thoughts drifted back to the faces in the faded photograph tucked safely in his pocket. He could almost hear their voices now. The laughter, the jokes, the moments of camaraderie they shared during rare breaks between missions. They had been more than teammates. They were brothers, bound together by shared sacrifice and unspoken trust. Now, standing alone on this sidewalk, Daniel couldn't help but feel the absence of their presence like a hollow echo inside him. It wasn't sadness so much as it was gratitude, a bittersweet acknowledgement of how much they had given him, even in death. He stopped for a moment, leaning against a lamppost as memories flooded his mind. He thought about Malik, whose quick wit always lightened the mood when things got dark, or Sarah, the medic who had patched up countless wounds, including Daniel's own, with steady hands and unwavering determination. And then there was James, his closest friend, who used to say, "We're not heroes, Danny. We're just doing what needs to be done." Those words had stuck with Daniel through the years, grounding him whenever self-doubt crept in. But now, after today's events, he wondered if maybe they weren't entirely true. Maybe being a hero wasn't about grand gestures or accolades. It was about showing up, even when the odds were stacked against you, about carrying the weight of loss and pain without letting it break you. Daniel pushed off the lamppost and resumed walking, his pace slower now, deliberate. He passed by small shops and cafes, their windows glowing warmly in the fading daylight. People hurried past him, some chatting animatedly on phones, others lost in their own worlds. None of them noticed the man walking among them, carrying stories, etched into every line on his face. To them, he was just another pedestrian, indistinguishable from the rest. But Daniel didn't mind. Anonymity suited him well enough these days. What mattered most was the quiet resolve growing within him, a determination to honor those who had fallen by finding purpose in his own life again. His phone buzzed in his pocket, startling him out of his thoughts. Pulling it out, he saw a text, message from an unknown number. "Hey, it's Rachel from the courthouse. Thought you might need someone to talk to. Call anytime." Below her name was a phone number and a brief note. "I work with veterans support groups. Let me know if you want info." Daniel stared at the screen for a long moment, his thumb hovering over the keys. Part of him wanted to reply immediately, to pour out all the emotions swirling inside him. But another part, the cautious part, held him back. He wasn't used to opening up, especially to strangers. Still, something about Rachel's message struck a chord. It wasn't intrusive or demanding, it was simple, genuine, like an olive branch extended across the divide of loneliness. Pocketing the phone, Daniel decided to wait before responding. Instead, he focused on putting one foot in front of the other, navigating the familiar streets toward home. His apartment building loomed ahead, its brick facade weathered but sturdy, much like Daniel himself. Climbing the stairs to his unit, he fumbled with the key for a moment before unlocking the door and stepping inside. The space was modest, a single bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a living room barely big enough for the worn couch and mismatched armchair, but it was his. A sanctuary, however humble. Dropping his keys onto the counter, Daniel moved to the window and pulled back the curtain slightly. From here, he could see the city skyline stretching out in the distance, lights beginning to twinkle like stars against the deepening twilight. He stood there for a while watching the world go by, feeling both connected to it and apart from it. It was a strange sensation, one he'd grown accustomed to over the years. Civilians lived their lives oblivious to the sacrifices made on their behalf, and while Daniel didn't expect gratitude, sometimes he wished they understood, not for his sake, but for theirs, for the chance to see the humanity behind the uniform. Turning away from the window, Daniel sank into the armchair, its cushions sagging slightly under his weight. On the coffee table in front of him lay the envelope handed to him earlier by one of the strangers outside the courthouse. He picked it up now, running his fingers over the smooth paper. Inside, he found a check made out in his name, along with a handwritten note. "For all you've done and continue to do, thank you." Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes, but he blinked them away quickly, folding the note carefully, and tucking it back into the envelope. Money wouldn't solve all his problems, but it was a start, a tangible reminder that people cared, even if they didn't fully understand. For the next hour, Daniel sat in silence, allowing himself to process everything that had happened. The courtroom drama, the judge's unexpected leniency, the outpouring of support from strangers. It all felt surreal, like fragments of someone else's story. Yet, deep down, he knew it was real. And slowly, tentatively, hope began to take root within him. Hope that maybe, just maybe, he could turn things around. That the future wasn't written in stone, no matter how bleak it seemed. Eventually, exhaustion caught up with him, pulling at his eyelids and dulling the sharp edges of his thoughts. Rising from the chair, Daniel shuffled to the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water. As he drank, he glanced at the stack of mail piled on the counter, untouched for days. Among the bills and advertisements, he spotted a letter from the VA. Setting down the glass, he tore open the envelope and scanned its contents. It was an update on his disability claim, a bureaucratic maze he'd been navigating for years. This time, however, the news was different. His application had finally been approved, granting him additional benefits and resources to aid in his recovery. A slow smile spread across Daniel's face, the first genuine one in months. It wasn't a miracle cure, nor did it erase the challenges ahead. But it was progress. And in that moment, progress felt like enough. The days that followed the court hearing felt different for Daniel. They weren't perfect, and there were still moments when the weight of his past pressed heavily on him. But something had shifted. It was as if a door he thought was permanently closed had creaked open just enough to let in a sliver of light. Each morning he woke up with a sense of purpose, not the kind driven by grand ambitions, but the quiet determination to take one step forward, no matter how small. For someone who had spent years feeling stuck, even the tiniest progress felt monumental. Daniel started attending meetings at the veterans support group Rachel had mentioned. At first he hesitated, unsure if he belonged in a room full of strangers sharing their struggles. But Rachel had been persistent, texting him reminders and encouragement until he finally agreed to give it a try. The first meeting was awkward. He sat in the back corner, arms crossed, listening silently while others spoke about their battles with PTSD, unemployment, and loneliness. Yet, as the weeks went by, Daniel found himself opening up bit by bit. He talked about his friends who hadn't made it home, the sleepless nights haunted by memories he couldn't escape, and the frustration of feeling invisible in a world that moved too fast to notice him. To his surprise, people listened, not out of obligation, but because they understood. For the first time in years, Daniel felt like he wasn't alone. One evening, after a particularly emotional session, Rachel approached him with a warm smile. "You're doing great, Daniel," she said, her voice soft but firm. "It takes courage to face these things head-on." She handed him a flyer for a job training program specifically designed for veterans. "I think this might interest you. It's not much, but it's a start." Daniel studied the flyer, reading over the details. The program offered skills workshops, career counseling, and even connections to employers looking to hire veterans. It wasn't glamorous, but it was practical, a lifeline thrown into the chaos of his life. "Thanks," he said, tucking the flyer into his pocket. "I'll think about it." But deep down, he already knew he would sign up. The idea of learning new skills, of proving to himself that he could adapt and grow, appealed to him in a way he hadn't expected. Over the next few weeks, Daniel threw himself into the program, attending classes and practicing what he learned with a focus that surprised even him. His instructors noticed his dedication, often pulling him aside to offer words of encouragement. "You've got potential, Daniel," one of them said during a break. "Don't sell yourself short." Meanwhile, the financial pressures that had once loomed so large began to ease, thanks to the combination of the VA benefits and the donation from the stranger at the courthouse. Daniel used the money wisely, paying off some of his smaller debts and setting aside a portion for emergencies. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was drowning. Instead, he felt like he was treading water, and maybe, just maybe, swimming toward shore. As the months passed, Daniel's confidence grew. He landed a part-time job through the training program, working as a logistics coordinator for a local company. It wasn't glamorous work, but it gave him structure and stability, two things he desperately needed. More importantly, it reminded him that he was capable, that he still had value to offer. On his first paycheck, he treated himself to a decent meal at a diner near his apartment. Sitting in the booth, he looked around at the other patrons, sipping coffee or chatting quietly with friends. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like an outsider looking in. He felt like he belonged. Outside of work, Daniel continued to build connections with the people at the support group, with Rachel, and even with a few neighbors he'd never bothered talking to before. Slowly, tentatively, he began to rebuild his life piece by piece. He kept the photograph of his unit close, carrying it everywhere as a reminder of where he'd come from and why he kept going. Sometimes, late at night, he'd sit by the window and talk to them as if they were still there, sharing updates on his progress and thanking them for giving him the strength to keep moving forward. One crisp autumn afternoon, Daniel returned to the courthouse, not as a defendant but as a visitor. He wanted to thank the judge personally for seeing beyond the surface, for recognizing the humanity beneath the legal case. Standing outside the imposing building, he hesitated for a moment, wondering if he should turn back, but then he remembered James's voice saying, "We don't back down, Danny." Not unless we've tried everything. Taking a deep breath, Daniel pushed open the heavy doors and walked inside. The clerk directed him to the judge's chambers, where he waited nervously until the door opened. The judge greeted him warmly, shaking his hand and inviting him to sit. "Mr. Carter," he said, smiling faintly. "This is a pleasant surprise. How are things going?" Daniel nodded, his expression serious but hopeful. "Better, Your Honor. I just wanted to say thank you for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself. I'm trying to make the most of the second chance you gave me." The judge leaned back in his chair, studying Daniel thoughtfully. "Second chances are rare in this world, Mr. Carter, but they're also earned. You've carried burdens most people can't fathom, yet you haven't let them define you. That's a testament to your character." Daniel swallowed hard, emotion tightening his throat. "I won't waste it," he promised. "I owe it to the people who stood by me, and to the ones who didn't make it home." When he left the courthouse that day, Daniel felt lighter than he had in years. The air seemed fresher, the sky bluer. As he walked down the steps, he spotted Rachel waiting for him near the entrance. She waved, her smile wide and genuine. "How did it go?" she asked as he approached. "Good," he replied, returning her smile. "Really good." Over the next year, Daniel's life continued to improve. He transitioned from part-time to full-time work, earning promotions and gaining the respect of his colleagues. He stayed active in the veterans community, mentoring others who were struggling to find their footing. And though the scars of his past remained, they became less painful over time, like wounds that had healed but left behind faint marks. On the anniversary of the mission that changed his life, Daniel visited a memorial dedicated to fallen soldiers. Standing before the engraved names, he placed a single flower at the base of the monument. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "For everything." As he turned to leave, he paused, looking up at the clear blue sky. Somewhere, somehow, he knew his comrades were watching over him. They had given him the strength to survive, to endure, and now to thrive. And as he walked away, he realized that the greatest victory wasn't winning battles or overcoming obstacles. It was finding peace within himself no matter how long it took.